Dr. Smith and his wife live in Amarillo. They have a baby girl, and we're so glad to have Dr. Smith with us today. So, Jason, if you'll take it away.
All right.
Let's give him a round of applause.
Well, thank you, Andy. I certainly appreciate the opportunity. And if I don't use that microphone, can y'all hear me okay?
Not as good.
Not as good. All right, I'll use the microphone then. All right, well, appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be here. One note that Krista asked me to mention was about the Wi-Fi.
H County 1. H County is lowercase and the number 1 if you need it.
So if anybody needs to join later on and forget that or forgets that at that time, just catch Krista or Andy and they'll be able to get you that information. So, when Andy initially called me about this topic in today's presentation, I was in Oklahoma City at our National Animal Science meetings. This is back in July. And at that time, there were still parts of the Texas Panhandle that had not grown forage this year. Not just that they hadn't grown much forage, zero forage had been grown in those areas, particularly the western side of Amarillo into parts of New Mexico. And as you go southwest, there's still some places that have greened up some, but still don't have a substantial amount of forage. Luckily, a large portion of the Panhandle has received some rainfall, and I'll admit, received rainfall at a time that I was very nervous if some of our warm season perennials would respond or how well they would respond to that. But we've grown quite a bit of grass, and there's been very fortunate here in the northeastern portion of the Panhandle to have, in some places, an overabundance, I don't want to say overabundance, an abundance of forage. And that is certainly a blessing. And so when Andy asked me to cover this topic, I was thinking about where we were in some of the other parts of the Panhandle. I thought, what the heck am I going to talk about? Because we've spent the better part of the summer discussing drought management, drought mitigation strategies. And there's still parts of the Panhandle we're still heavily focused and heavily emphasizing in that area. Okay, but I'm going to take a little different approach. So I'm going to talk about this from a little different angle than Justin and Tim and I and a few others have been focusing on throughout the summer. And I'm going to talk about opportunities created by drought, created by where we are in the current cattle cycle, and by an abundance of forages in certain situations. Okay. And so how we think about some of these things that I'm going to talk about or how they might apply to our operations is going to be somewhat dependent upon what we normally do and what we normally don't do on that operation. But my goal is to provide something for everyone. So some information that will hopefully be useful or that you could use to evaluate what you're currently doing on your operation or planning as we move into the fall. In the winter months. There's going to be some stuff that I think is incredibly relevant to those that may have culled heavily or completely liquidated their herds. So how many of you culled to some degree because of drought over the past 2 years? Okay, so I would say that's probably the vast majority of us that have cattle in a room culled to some degree, or at least some degree more than what we have done previously. Okay, how many of you have an abundance of forage going into the fall right now? Okay, so not as many, but a few of you. Okay, I'm going to focus in some things I think that I encourage you to consider, and regardless of whether you raised your hand or not to any of those questions, I hope that there's going to be something here that's valuable for you. I also want to take a little bit of time at the end of the program to mention 2 topics that I think are timely. One of them fits into this. They both fit into drought in some way, shape, or form, but they're things that I wanted to make sure that we took the opportunity to get in front of you if you weren't already aware of them. The thing I would encourage you, if you are one of those people that's been blessed with an abundance of forages, don't forget where we came from. Okay, I'm not a meteorologist. You'll hear from Brian Bledsoe later on in the day, but everything I've heard says we are not out of this drought just yet. Okay. And so I encourage you to keep that in the back of your mind. But the reality is that, at least my perception has been that we typically have somewhat short-term memories of some of our hardships, some of our troubles. we're really quick to react to improving conditions and really slow to respond to declining conditions. I think we have an opportunity to shift that paradigm, to think about that in a little different way. And so I would encourage you to, rather than, managing for the best conditions and reacting to the worst, why don't we reevaluate our management strategies and set them up to be tailored towards those worst situations, those worst scenarios, and then react when we have the opportunity to take advantage of some of those better or improving conditions. Okay, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about today would be that scenario. Okay, so things that we might be able to do to take advantage of some of those if we're stocked conservatively and we're planning for the worst. Okay, the other that I already mentioned is our reaction speed. Okay, we're really, really fast to react when conditions improve. We're typically far too slow to react when conditions are deteriorating, because this country, when we see those conditions deteriorating, that began quite some time ago. And we are already behind the 8 ball in responding to those. So I encourage you to be very conscious of those things. The other thing that I'll mention is a lot of you know, a lot of true forage-based aspects, I defer to Tim. I defer to Jordan. I defer to those of AgriLife Extension that focus in rangeland management, that focus in agronomy. But what I will say is, reality is beef cattle production in this part of the world, we are dependent, at least for cow-calf operations, stocker operations, we're dependent upon grass. Without it, we can't really do a whole heck of a lot. Now, one of the things, coming from an area where forages didn't necessarily require as much rest, this is something that I've embraced and certainly now appreciate about the Texas Panhandle, is our native perennial grasses need rest. Okay? They need some relief. That continuous grazing pressure and repeated overgrazing can be catastrophic to those forage stands. Okay? And so I'm going to talk about some things you might be able to do to use some of that extra grass, but I want you to keep in the back of your mind that we also need to consider the opportunity of, I don't want to say wasting some of that grass, but potentially conserving some of that forage, using that as an opportunity, particularly on those pastures that we've recently overgrazed. Let's use this as an opportunity to rest some of those pastures. Okay, and then maybe take advantage of some of that additional forage in those pastures that maybe were only lightly abused or didn't take quite as much abuse over the past few years. If we're in a situation where that's not an option for us and more of a continuous grazing scenario, that's a situation where if we are going to use them, we want to stock them conservatively. We want to be on the lighter side of that, and that's about the extent to which I'm going to address that. I'm sure Tim's probably going to touch some of those later on today. Okay, I would encourage you to utilize the grasses that exist, and some of those hopefully that are growing now and will continue to grow for a little while, as strategically as possible. Okay? And for me, from a nutritionist standpoint, that requires pairing how and when we utilize them with forage abundance, but also with nutrient quality. Okay, and some of our different grasses can do a better job at different times than others at meeting the needs of cattle. Some of those grasses will hang on to their nutrients far longer than others. So I'd encourage you to focus on utilizing those forages if you're going to graze them, if you're going to utilize them. Those that are likely to decline in quality faster, let's use them before they decline in quality. And let's preserve some of those that are likely to hang on to that quality longer to where we use them later on in the wintertime. Okay? And so I think those forages that do a really good job of hanging on to nutrient quality would be our short grasses. Our short grass, warm season perennials, buffalo grass, blue grama. Okay? Those are some forages that hang on to nutrient quality and content for an extended period of time. Far longer than a lot of our cool season perennial grasses, our mid grasses, and our tall grasses do. So if you think about those situations where we've maybe liquidated some cows or the entire herd, I'd also encourage you, if you have received some precipitation, you've got some grass, and we're restocking, We're starting to add some females to that operation. We're starting to add some stockers to the operation. From a cow-calf standpoint, though, let's use this as an opportunity to reshape our herd, if that is warranted. So let's use this as an opportunity to populate our herd with genetics that are going to allow us to achieve our goals. Okay, so let's focus on retaining, building that herd with those females that are going to allow us to do those things. Okay, most of us, from a long-term standpoint, the thing we don't want to forget about is the bull, because the reality is he is how we are injecting genetics into the herd. So now particularly is a phenomenal time to focus on those genetics, be strategic and very selective about those that we're going to incorporate into our herd that are going to be the future of what we're marketing in a calf crop. And in doing that, hopefully we can position ourselves a little better to survive the next drought. Now, spent a lot of time talking about drought management strategies. We're focusing today on some of the things that we might want to consider if we are restocking. I do want to encourage you, if we have destocked to some degree and we're restocking, or even if we haven't done that, if we want to be very strategic about production and we want to make strategic decisions, whether it's now, whether we wish we could have done it in the past or we're going to do it in the future, there are some gateway practices that enable us to take advantage of higher level management. Okay, without these, a lot of these higher level management practices are incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to incorporate. So for me, there's three things that we have to have in place, we have to do to be able to embrace those higher level management strategies as effectively as possible. That's individual animal identification. We need to know who they are. That's record keeping. We need to know what they've done. Okay? And then that's having a defined breeding and calving season. Okay? Those are, if I want to say, the three most important things from just a straight cattle, not necessarily grazing management, but a cattle management standpoint. Those are the three big players for me. Okay, all of us have the ability to do those. We actively make the choice not to, or we actively make the choice to. Okay, so I would encourage you now, if you haven't already embraced those, to take this as an opportunity at least to consider incorporating them into your operation. Because if we want to make risk or return-based management decisions, it becomes very difficult to do those without that information. It's impossible to do those at the individual animal level. We can do those at an entire herd level without that information. But if we want to make specific animal-to-animal decisions, it takes that information to be able to do so. We think about retaining heifers and repopulating the herd. To me, this is where we start. This is where we set the foundation for what those females are going to look like as mature cows. So for me, she needed to have performed at an acceptable level as a calf. If she didn't do what we needed to as a calf, there's no reason for us to keep her as a cow. It's as simple as that. Okay? To me, she needed to be healthy. Not just that she needed to survive. She absolutely needed to survive, but she needed to be healthy. If I had to treat her for something as a calf, I don't want to keep her as a cow. That is one direct means through which I can put selection pressure on health. Okay, so I want to identify those that have been healthy, that start cycling, they get pregnant, they calve by the time that I need them to calve by, they do it again. Okay, so they rebreed. Okay, probably our biggest challenge with replacement heifers. They rebreed, and then they go on and wean a healthy, desirable calf. Okay, those cows, we want to focus on those cows that are absolutely going to calve and be productive once a year. Okay, so they put a calf on the ground and they raise that calf through weaning. I make a point to call that one out. We do a really good job of talking about selling open cows. Okay, we don't do a good job at focusing on and get rid of those cows that got bred but did not raise that calf. We often make excuses for those. That cow potentially costs me far more than that cow that just didn't get bred, because at least that one that didn't get bred, I can identify her really early on and we can market her, right? It's those that put a calf on the ground and that calf died 0 to 6 months later, I have that additional expense in that female and she has nothing to show for it. So we want to focus on those that have been productive, they maintain adequate condition in our environment, and they do that with little to no protein and energy supplementation, and hopefully they do it without tearing up our people or tearing up our stuff. Okay. As we think about different means through which we might be able to take advantage of some of these opportunities that might have been created. One of those that as we've been experiencing this drought for some time, and I think somebody had mentioned that we're really in a drought that didn't just start a couple years ago. This drought's been going on for a lot longer than that, okay? But if we're in a situation where we might be over leveraged, we have some notes that we need to pay off. We need to cover those in the short term. Justin's going to talk about this in a lot more detail, but where we are in the cattle cycle, where we're moving in terms of cattle value, this might be an opportunity to take advantage of the incredibly high value, particularly for young, productive females. Okay, so those might be bred heifers, those might be our 3 and 4 year old young cows that for us are at highest risk of a production failure. Those are the females that are at highest risk of coming up open or potentially not raising a calf. But they're likely to be most valuable to somebody who is trying to find some replacement females for those operations. Justin's going to tell you, I think, roughly what those are worth right now in a general sense. Okay, but this might be an opportunity to utilize them to position ourselves a little better from a long-term standpoint, maybe not short-term, but long-term standpoint moving forward. And we may have some opportunity to develop heifer calves that we would have previously marketed as feeder cattle as replacement females and take advantage of some additional revenue that they might be able to generate. Okay, is that going to work across the board? No. And that's where I encourage everyone to consider any of these alternative options at your individual ranch or even herd within the ranch level. Okay, I encourage you to put pencil to paper and determine if those are going to be valuable to you or not. And that applies to anything and everything that I have told you, I will tell you today, or I will ever tell you in the future. Okay, evaluate that at your local level. Okay, other ways we might add additional value to calves that we may have not captured in the past. If we've just been stripping calves from the cows and weaning them on diesel fuel, as I'll refer to it, selling balling calves, this is an opportunity, particularly if we're in a situation where we have some additional forage, to go ahead and wean, precondition, and maybe even background those calves for an extended period of time. What that will do is, in addition to adding some additional value through bells and whistles to those calves, and Justin's going to tell you a little bit about what some of those things are worth, that also allows us to take advantage of where we're hopefully moving to in terms of future late winter and spring feeder cattle prices. Okay, mentioned developing replacement heifers, but the key thing is, if we want to add value to cattle, we have to market them in a way that allows us to realize that value. If they're not marketed accordingly, somebody else is going to buy those cattle to take advantage of the value that you've created in them. So I encourage you to develop relationships, close relationships with whoever it is that you would consider to be your marketing partner for those cattle. And I'm very careful about how I choose those words. Because if all we're doing is telling someone where to send the check when we slam the gate shut and jump in the truck and take off, that's the only information about those cattle we're providing. That's not a relationship. We're not doing ourselves any due diligence in trying to capture some of that additional value. Okay? Now, if we're used to wintering cows and we're considering wintering calves, that's a little bit of an apples to oranges comparison or a relationship, because they're not the same thing. We have to do some things a little differently to manage those, particularly to manage calves at what I would consider an acceptable level. So manage them to where they're going to at least grow some throughout that winter period. And I know that sounds a little bit general, but that's the reality of it, is if we're going to keep them and we want that to to be a worthwhile and valuable investment, we can't only just plan to capitalize on some upswing in the market. Because unless we are selling a large volume of cattle on a very regular basis, we're subject to whatever swing happened on that day or that week. And that's something we need to keep in mind as we plan for marketing cattle. But in terms of this cow versus calf management comparison, okay, on an equal unit of body weight basis, calves have higher nutrient requirements than cows do. Okay? Okay? As cattle get bigger, as animals get bigger, they actually become more efficient on a per unit of body weight basis, not on a total animal basis necessarily, but per unit of body weight. So the example that we use in nutrition, any of the students over here want to shout it out? It's a mouse versus an elephant. The elephant has far greater nutrient requirements than the mouse does. But per pound, per whatever unit of weight, that mouse's requirements are far greater than that elephant's are. The same apply to cow. Okay? So those calves have proportionally greater nutrient requirements than the cows do. The calves will also typically consume more forage than the cows do. Yes, ma'am?
At what point does that start? Some people have fall calving cows, and so does that start, at what age do you think that begins to come into effect on a nursing calf?
So that concept applies across the board at any weight. So that's independent of when that calf is born, when that cow's calving, anything along those lines. What happens though, and what we often see and might confuse with that, is that if we have cow nutrient requirements that are dispaired from our forage supply. Okay, and so that's not always, but often the case for us when we're fall calving, is that that cow is calving just after or when we have peak forage supply and abundance. Her nutrient requirements are going to be highest 2 months down the road when that has started to decline and tail off. And so oftentimes we'll see that as cows losing condition, more so than they would have as spring calvers and those things. But that relationship holds true from the day they're born, essentially. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So those calves will consume, again, proportionally per unit of body weight, more forage than the cows will. And so in a scenario where a cow will consume 2% of her body weight in dry matter, I'm typically going to assume that calf's going to consume somewhere in the vicinity of 2.2 to 2.4, 2.5% of its body weight in dry matter from the same forage. I put this in front of you because if we feed those calves the same way we feed those cows just to maintain their body weight, particularly low requirement cows, so those dry mid-gestation cows, those calves may at best not lose weight. Okay? They're not going to gain weight under that management. And I bring that up because we have to feed them, we have to manage them accordingly if we want them to perform throughout that time period. Typically, if we think about this part of the world, and this is under the assumption that we're not running cattle on wheat pasture or some other cool season annual, because wheat pasture, cool season annuals, phenomenal forage when they exist, typically support 2 to 2.5 pounds a day average daily gain on stocker cattle, will meet 100% of cow nutrient requirements at any point in her productive year, if that animal has access to consume whatever amount of forage it would consume. But in a situation where we're running cattle on what I'll call hard grasses, okay? So we're running cattle on some of our perennial forages, okay? And we're wintering those cattle, they're typically going to require some protein and energy supplementation to support satisfactory performance for growing cattle, okay? We're going to have to supplement them with something if we want them to do more than just exist throughout that time period, okay? We also have the opportunity to utilize and embrace the use of some of our growth promoting technologies. And two of them that I'm going to talk a little bit about would be ionophores and implants, okay? But I'm a nutritionist, I got to talk about a little bit of nutrition when I have the opportunity, right? Okay, so from a protein and energy supplementation standpoint, for wintering stocker cattle, okay, in our environment, we're typically going to receive the greatest return. We're going to optimize that supplementation program at relatively low levels of supplementation. Okay, so we would probably observe at least what appears to be a greater benefit at low levels of high protein supplementation in these stocker cattle than we would for cows. Doesn't mean we're not getting the same benefit out of the cows. We're just going to see it a little differently in those stocker cattle. Okay, so as a general rule of thumb, and absolutely this is an extension answer, it depends, right? But if I were going to throw you one set of numbers on low-level supplementation, we'll call it a 38% cake on, a pound per head per day on 5 to 7 weight stocker cattle. That's typically going to fetch between 1/4 and 1/2 pound of additional gain in those calves. Okay, that protein is supporting an energy-dependent level of growth, but it's allowing those cattle to get more energy out of the forages because it is providing them with the rumen with what it needs to actually digest that forage. Okay, so we're getting energy out of protein because of how it's changing digestive physiology of that animal. When we start supplementing at higher levels in this scenario, okay, we're typically gonna, as we supplement more, there's gonna be a diminishing return on investment. Okay, the thing to keep in mind is that doesn't necessarily mean that that might not be economically advantageous. Yes, sir.
What months are you talking about on the pound per head per day? What actual months are you talking about, 0.3 to 0.5?
Yeah, so that would be on roughly, we'll call him a wean calf. So that's going to be a 6-7 month old to a yearling steer calf is what I'm going to assume that. This would be winter months on those stocker cattle, assuming they've got free choice, complete access to what was good quality but is now dormant native range pastures. Okay. Okay.
My experience is December, January, February, 0.3 to 0.5 over again.
Okay.
That's just my experience.
Yep. And that's at what level of supplementation?
Averaging 2 pounds a day, probably.
Average, and is that every day, or is that every other day, or every?
We can do it every other day. but
Every
it
other
kinda
day.
Works out to a 2 pound deal, but it's usually on
Okay.
30%.
It's on a 30%, and that's where we get, in this situation, that's where that higher level of supplementation tends to return a little more. As we drop that protein level in this scenario, this is far less. But it may be a situation where those forages are supporting maintenance. They're supporting maintenance of those cattle, which is what I would typically assume in that time of the year if it's dormant native range. And then that gain you're getting is likely out of what you're supplementing those cattle with. That's what I would assume in that scenario.
Quite a bit of tall grass, it may not even be that good.
That is, yes, if it's a tall grass, it may not even support maintaining their weight. That's right. No, I agree 100%. Okay. As we drop protein level in this type, and I'm an energy guy. Okay, I'm talking about protein right now, but I'm all about energy when it comes to changing performance. Okay, we're using this as a means of getting additional energy into the cattle. Okay, but when we drop that level, that's being diluted with either starch or fiber, right? And so we're not getting as much of that benefit, and then that nutrient is likely displacing some of the forage that they're consuming. So we would see this level start to drop. So I think those numbers pair pretty well with this. Okay. Now I mentioned we'd expect diminishing return on investment as we start to feed them more. That doesn't necessarily mean that feeding them more may not be economically advantageous. It just means that our true, as we would calculate it, return on that investment might be a little lower. It doesn't mean that it's not still an additional positive return on the additional investment. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. And I think that's an important thing for us to evaluate. Yeah, Kelly.
Hey, Jason, is this still consensus that you want to have at least a 24% cube to get maximum utilization out of that supplement? Anything below a 24%, it's hard to utilize. Is that still?
I can't say if it's consensus, but from my standpoint, yes. I think that's where we need to be, is roughly that mid-20s and up range. Okay, so anywhere at that level, and in a lot of situations, that's where what will get tagged as a 28, but really a distiller's cube can work well, particularly at these really low levels of supplementation. But yes, I think that's where we are. When we get lower than that, we're typically diluting a lot of that out with corn or something else, whatever at that time is going to be the most economical source to get in there. Something that's going to be cheaper than soybean meal, cottonseed meal, or distillers.
So you mentioned distiller's green cubes. So typically, what are they going to be protein delivered? I
Yep.
mean, as fed.
Yep.
Protein is going to be 27%.
So as fed, they're going to be 26 to 28%. Dry basis, they're typically going to be in the 30 to low 30s range, and they're going to run about 90% dry matter. But they will have substantially greater energy that comes along with them than most of the other products that we're comparing them to, because they are incredibly high energy. Now, some of that changes when we start pulling fat out at the ethanol plant, which a lot of them are doing right now. But where we have to be careful with them is when we start feeding them at really, really high levels. And then we potentially start to depress some forage.
So one more
utilization.
question on
Yeah.
that, because it is a good feed. It just depends whether it works for you or doesn't.
Yep.
But is there kind of a minimum amount of fat that you'd kind of draw the line at on those extruded cubes? Say, hey, once it falls below 6%, 9%, 8% fat.
Yeah.
Do you kind of say, hey, below this,
Yeah.
you're diminishing quite a bit?
Once we get below 6 to 7 is when, on the tag, is when we start to lose a decent amount of that energy content out of the product. What I will say, my understanding is most of the cubes that are being marketed now are still going to be at that level or above. I say 6 to 7. Most of the time that product, if it's straight, it has not had the fat spun off of it, it's going to run about 10% is where we're going to be. We're going to be 10 to 12 on most of that. Most places are going to pull a little bit of it off. Most places are not pulling a lot off. So most of the time our conventional distillers is going to run in that 7 to 10% range anyway. And from a dietary standpoint though, where we'd start getting into problems because there's a fear of feeding fat sometimes, is we don't want to get that animal in a forage-based setting. We don't want to get total dietary fat above 5%. We get above 5%, we start to change some dynamics of forage digestion. Feed yard, we can feed considerably more than that. We can go up 7.5%, not run into issues. But we'd have to be caking cows a decent amount or caking cattle a decent amount to get them to that point, to where we're starting to substantially depress fiber utilization. When we feed anything at a certain level though, it will start to depress forage consumption because it's replacing. Depending upon what it is, it might replace or displace forages. Yep.
So when you talk about a 38% cube, are you mostly in your head thinking cottonseed?
That's cottonseed meal cake. Yep. That's a primarily cottonseed, or it could be bean meal depending upon price, but most time for us it's going to be cottonseed meal. Yep.
What's the fat on cottonseed? I forgot.
The fat on the cottonseed in this context is going to be very low. So it's going to be, think of it as similar level as most of our other ingredients that we don't think are very high in fat. So it's typically going to run about 3% on that. Now, if we're talking about whole cottonseed, it's going to be way higher than that. But that's because at this point, the fat's been pulled out of it. Yep. Do you have a question, Tim? Okay. Perfect. All right. Now, I'm a huge proponent of making economics-based decisions, and so supplementation decisions for me are no different than that. We do have this tool that's available, and I encourage you to check it out and utilize it if you're interested. This is a program that Dr. Benavidez and I built, but it is designed to help you identify the most economical source of supplemental nutrients for your operation. So it can be used at a very simple level or a very high level. Okay, it's intended for you to enter information that's unique to your operation. It's available for free online at beef.tamu.edu under the publications tab. And there are a number of other decision-making tools that are available there and elsewhere. But I encourage you to check this one out if you're interested in using it. Andy can help get it to you. And if you're interested in using it and look at it, it's got an instruction sheet. We've got a publication of instructions to accompany it. But if you still have questions, want us to help you run through it and use it, more than happy to help y'all work through a scenario. Okay, I'd encourage you, and we're still working on a similar tool to help evaluate this. Is don't forget the hidden costs of supplementation. So supplementing cattle costs more than just what it costs for us to get that product delivered to the yard or to the barn or wherever the ranch headquarters or wherever we're going to store it. Okay, so transportation, delivery, what it costs us to actually store it, what it costs us to deliver it to cattle, our labor and our time, and then the one we probably do the poorest job of evaluating is shrink. Okay, so what we paid for that the cattle never actually consume. Okay, I do need to mention mineral and vitamin supplementation because I think it's critically important as we go in. I think it's critically important year round, but even more important as we go into times of forage dormancy, particularly growing cattle. Okay, meeting their mineral and vitamin requirements will result in a substantial change in what those cattle get out of the forages that they're consuming. Okay, salt is not an adequate replacement for a complete and comprehensive mineral nutrition program. I would argue that if we're feeding a salt-based mineral supplement, there's no reason for us to feed salt to those cattle on the side. All that's going to do is make them consume less of that complete mineral supplement. Okay. Typically on stocker cattle, we're going to expect a 10 to 30% change or improvement in growth performance as a consequence of meeting their nutrient requirements through mineral supplementation compared to either not supplementing them or only supplementing them with trace mineralized salt. I've thrown some numbers up there on vitamin A. It's one that, I had it in some other presentations recently talking about drought, and one we need to keep in the back of our minds. The reality is that assume that dormant forage is completely void in at least usable vitamin A by the animal. I've got some numbers up there of what that supplement needs to be. If it's a 4 ounce per head per day mineral or a 2 ounce per head per day consumption mineral, this is roughly where we need to be on the feed tag if that product is going to meet all their vitamin A requirements. Okay, probably not going to be as critical on growing cattle as it is on cows, particularly cows that will be coming out of the winter and getting ready to calve. Yes, sir.
I've heard some things about the source of vitamin A being scarce and maybe some lower quality vitamin A being in our feed products. What do you know about that?
So, 2018, for 2017, 2018, so one of the major vitamin A manufacturers overseas, that plant burned. Okay, and so that was actually the precursor for vitamin A that's used to make a lot of products or contribute vitamin A to a lot of our mineral products. So that was, don't quote me on the number, roughly 60% of the source for the entire world. What happened then is a lot of manufacturers did one of two things. They either, if they could still get it, for some products, they jumped the price of the product to account for their increase in cost, supply and demand, right? Or they pulled a large portion of vitamin A out. Okay, my understanding is a number of those products, they put some of that vitamin A back in, maybe not to the level we had before. Historically, vitamin A was cheap. We overfed the heck out of it because it was cheap and because it was safe. We typically didn't do much harm by overfeeding it. Okay, what I would say is a lot of our, call them higher end, but retail type mineral, not even just retail, complete mineral supplements that were in the $25 to $30 or so a bag range, I'm not concerned about their level. They're probably going to be, I'm going to look at the tag, but they're probably going to be where they need. So when we start looking at some economy line supplements, and I'm not saying not to look at those, but those are things we need to be aware of because to get the cost down to that level, we're going to start, you have to pull certain things out. Okay, there's only so many things you can pack into something at a certain price point, right? And so that's one of those areas where they haven't come. In terms of sources, I haven't heard of any less valuable, less useful sources of vitamin A that have come on the market. One of the things we need to be careful about, though, is storage. Vitamin A is active, okay? And so if we're storing a mineral supplement for 6 months to a year, don't expect it to have the tagged level of vitamin A activity, because some of that's gonna be used up in that product. If it gets wet, okay, if we're storing it outside, those are things, sunlight, heat, those are things that cause vitamin A to deteriorate, and those are things we certainly need to be conscious of. Good questions though. Okay, ionophores, Rumensin, Bovatec, Monovet would be the three main ones. Those two, Rumensin and Monovet, are the same drug, different product. Bovatec is a different drug. They'll be the main ones available to us for grass cattle. They're selective antimicrobials. They improve feed efficiency. Expect, depending upon the scenario, 3 to 12% improvement in feed efficiency. Okay. The added benefit, they're effective at preventing and controlling cocci, as well as acidosis if we're grazing stalks. Costs roughly 4 pennies per head per day. So on a cow for a year, that's about $15 for what I'll say is, assume a 5% improvement in efficiency. That break even would be about a $300 a year cost for running a cow, for that to have paid for itself. How many of us can run a cow for less than $300 a year? Okay, it pays to use this. And I think Ted used to have a saying that I'm going to borrow from him, is that if you include Rumensin or Bovatec or Monovet in the mineral, it's going to pay for the cost of the mineral. And then you're going to get all those added benefits of the mineral without any additional expense. And I believe that is true. You have to be careful. Some of these are labeled for use in certain situations that others are not. So we got to use those in accordance with their tag. But just keep them away from horses. If you're running horses in pastures with cattle, you don't want to feed an ionophore out there. The likelihood of them killing something is actually pretty low. Okay, but horses can, not always are, but can be sensitive to ionophores. Okay, so just keep them away from the horses. Don't provide the horse access to them. Implants, the last one that I want to spend much time talking about. It's one I feel passionately about. I make $0 selling mineral ionophores or implants. I want to preface this with that. But I am a huge proponent of growth promoting hormone technologies. I spent a little bit of time working for FDA and the group that regulates some of these. And I'm a firm believer that if they're approved and available for use here in the U.S., they are safe for us to use, and they do what they're claimed to do on that label. Implants on stocker cattle, so these calves that we're trying to add some value to by retaining them, typically expect them to increase average daily gain by somewhere in the 8 to 20% range, depending upon quality of forage and what our normal level of gain is. So the response, so the percentage increase in that average daily gain is not dependent upon forage quality, but the magnitude of that response that we realize, so the change in total pounds of gain is. Okay? It takes nutrients to make nutrients. Okay? These implants increase the rate at which that happens, but they do it proportionally across different rations and different grazing scenarios. Okay, so I'd expect a similar percentage increase implanting cattle on low quality forage as I would to implanting cattle on high quality forage, although that will translate to that implant yielding me more pounds on that high quality forage. Okay, X% of 10 is still less than the same percent of 20. I'll use that as the example. That is the same on the ionophore. Now, there's some scenarios we could talk about with different ionophores where one might be more effective than the other based on forage quality. But yes, and the effect of the ionophore is completely independent and additive to the effect of the implant. So if we use both of them, we're going to get the benefit of both of them, and one of them is not going to reduce the benefit of the other. Okay, we've got a lot of options. I won't spend a lot of time here. We've got a publication we're working on finishing up that has all this outlined. I can talk to you about specific implants if you want to use them. We've kind of missed the boat unless we're fall calving on implanting those suckling calves. I would encourage you to implant them 70 to 100 days prior to weaning and doing something else with them. So roughly branding time. But even if we have missed that boat, re-implant those calves or implant them for the first time at weaning, particularly if we're going to precondition and background those calves. I'd probably do that with a higher potency implant than I used on the calves. So if I used a Ralgro or a Cinevex C or Component EC with Tylen on the calves, I'm probably going to use something that's a little stouter at weaning time. I might not if I'm going to rough those calves through the winter. Then I might not need to use something that's more aggressive. Okay, just make sure that you're marketing cattle through a program that allows the use of the implants. Okay, two things, and then I'll finish up, Andy, that I want to mention about some of the misperceptions of implant status and value of cattle. So if we look at a pretty large superior data set, look at cattle the lots were just listed as either implanted or non-implanted. No other considerations into this other than whether the listing said that the cattle were implanted or the listing said that the cattle were not implanted. So it's almost 3 million head. 2010 through 2013, no difference in price per pound, price per hundredweight of calves if they were implanted versus non-implanted. Okay, so if they're no different in what somebody's willing to pay for them, and we added an additional, we'll call it 30 pounds to that calf, is that valuable? Yeah, as long as we can do it for cheaper, as long as that value is greater than what it costs us to get it. Implants are actually probably almost always the greatest return on investment option for us from a growth promoting standpoint. There is a decent amount of information, at least that Justin and I have heard on what premiums for non-implanted cattle typically are. Okay, and so there's a little bit of a price matrix. In bold, I've got $1.80 and $1.90 for a 7-weight calf. It's futures market numbers for where we're going to be in the spring, hopefully, or better than that. But what I've done is I've assumed that we're going to get 28 pounds of additional weight out of that implant. And I've compared the added value of that implant, so these numbers, so at $1.90, it's just shy of $50 added value to that calf versus the added value of selling those cattle under an NHTC designated, this is an enrolled and verified program with a premium of about $2.50 per hundredweight. Okay, so difference between those values is still about a $30 advantage to implanting calves versus selling them. Now, I'm not saying there are not programs out there that will not pay you more than that value of the implant. We need to make sure that if we're not implanting, we're in one of those programs and we're getting that benefit. But most of them, the average that's been actually reported is about, right now's price equivalent, about $2.50 per hundredweight. Okay, so less than $20 per head for that NHTC enrollment. So still a $30 per head. We're often looking for silver bullets. Implants, on a force. Those are silver bullets for me in production. Okay. All right, I'd said there were two things I want to mention. Prussic acid, if you've got Johnson grass, you've got sorghums, most of us probably do somewhere. We're still learning a lot about some of these risk factors, nitrates and prussic acids in our warm season annual forages. What I will tell you, probably the most timely one right now that we're still learning and we're trying to figure out is what prussic acid does and doesn't do in certain situations. So we've all heard for a long time, well, don't graze Johnson grass right after it frosts, right? Or if we have it and it's in hay, it's dry hay, it's going to dissipate over time. Okay. What we're finding is that those two things are not true under all circumstances and all situations. Okay. So we've experienced some scenarios where cows that were fed forage sorghum hay, dry hay, that was harvested 6 months prior, died of prussic acid toxicity. Okay, we've seen that in 3 or 4 different scenarios over the past couple years. Okay, we've also done a little work with Johnson grass, and guess what happened to prussic acid in response to frost? Nothing. It did not change. It declined a little bit. It didn't increase. Our biggest risk factors for Johnson grass and any sorghums, for me, is going to be how tall that plant is and if it looks like it's stressed at all. Whether that's drought stress, whether that's temperature stress, whatever it might be. Okay? But stuff that's less than 2 feet tall, it's at risk for prussic acid. Okay, if it starts to regrow, and I think that's where we're learning on the frost side, if it starts to regrow after a non-killing frost, that's probably where we might run into some issues with prussic acid toxicity. We still have a lot to learn. We're actively working and trying to learn in this area and develop solutions for you all. We're not quite there yet, but I want to put it in front of you so that you're aware of it. If we're considering grazing a pasture that's got a lot of that in it, particularly if it's droughted out sorghum, sorghum stand, something along those lines, I'm a huge proponent of testing. Okay. What I will tell you though with that is our numbers, and I got some for nitrates and prussic acid. These are the numbers that I use. Okay. These are not gold standard. Okay. If I look at 10 different sources, I'm going to find 10 different sets of numbers, and none of them include the information, the research that was used to develop those numbers. We don't have a great idea of what the toxic levels of these are. We know what levels above which we've seen problems with in the past. Okay, so we have to take these toxic level numbers with a grain of salt. Okay, these are the numbers that I use. Okay, nothing more, nothing less. These are the numbers I've chosen to use. These are the numbers on the nitrates. I'll share those with anybody that wants them. Yeah.
Just so people know, we've been getting some tests in here. I've had several in here that are 2,000 to 3,000 parts per million just lately.
I've seen a dozen tests in the past week that are at that level.
So be careful. It's time to be careful.
And those tests, they may be high prussic acid and high nitrates. They may be just high nitrates. They may be just prussic acid. If you're going to test them, send them to, we work primarily with Servitech because of the way they do their analysis. Okay? They're the only lab in the country that we know of that includes a step that we believe is necessary to get to what we believe is recreating the conditions in the animal as closely as possible. So if you're going to test, I'd encourage you just test them for both. Reality is on nitrates, if there hasn't been a decent amount of nitrogen fertilization, you haven't had a fertilizer spill, something along those lines, probably not going to be a major issue unless that plant is severely drought stressed. And if that's the case, it's going to be the bottom of the plant that's likely the problem. And so we'll cut them or don't graze them.
So you're
that
saying
way.
that a frost may not necessarily take care of the prussic acid, that's what we always were taught.
Yes, ma'am. That's what I'm saying. Yep.
This will test.
We've got some data. Jason Banna is leading a group in East Texas where he's collected samples day before, day after, week after. We're not seeing meaningful reduction because of frost.
Okay.
Yep. And we can't find much of the data, any of the data that was used to say that it dissipates in dry hay and that it increases increases immediately, then drops to nothing in response to frost. We just haven't been able to find the data that was actually originally used to make some of those recommendations. So we're working on evaluating some of those things and putting numbers to it. The last one I want to mention is the FSA ELAP program. Anybody in here that would be purchasing hay that normally wouldn't have purchased it or is purchasing more than normal, there's opportunity to get some of those transportation costs recovered through the FSA ELAP program. Roughly 60% of the additional cost for transportation for the additional loads you can get returned. I'm going to leave it at that because there are some stipulations there. That's for feed transportation, water transportation, or livestock transportation. But I encourage you, if you're interested in that, if that'll apply to you, visit with your FSA rep. Take home points. Just be very strategic about what we're doing, and let's make sure if we're going to utilize some of these additional opportunities, we're not shooting ourselves in the foot by doing so. Let's make sure we've got the long term of the operation in the back of our minds, and then let's utilize some of those extras if we have the opportunity. Appreciate y'all asking questions and interacting. I've enjoyed this. I'm going to be here all day, so certainly appreciate any other questions or conversations later on. I know we're running a little behind, so I'll hand it over to Andy.
So Jason, a couple of things I want to say. First of all, don't you see what I said about this guy being a star? He really knows his stuff, so let's give him a big round of applause.
I don't know if I agree with it, but I appreciate it.